Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. I am Janet Yang Rohr. I am the state representative for the District 41 in Illinois, which includes Naperville, Warrenville, and Bolingbrook. As many of you know, March is Women's History Month, but wanted to make sure you knew how it came to be. In 1981, Congress passed a resolution that requested the president to proclaim the week beginning March 7th, 1982, as Women's History Month or Women's History Week, after actually. And, annual resolutions were passed each year after that until March 1987, when Women's History Month was officially recognized. And so today we've put together an expert panel in honor of Women's History Month that will focus on the local and larger community impact of Theilgaard Watts. Women such as May Watts lived in a time when their accomplishments could go unnoticed, and therefore their stories could easily be forgotten. So it is our hope today to make sure to share her story, to make sure that you all know it, and hopefully that it inspires you to share the story of May Watts with others and to be inspired by her contributions. And we have a great group of panelists here who are connected to May Watts in many different ways. I'm going to jump right in and introduce you to the panelists. And let's just start with our very special guest, Bridget Watts. Bridget, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and telling us about your relationship with May Watts?
Well, I'm May Theilgaard Watts's granddaughter. Her son, Tom Watts, was my father. And I was born in 1950 and she died in 1975. So I knew her for about 25 years and got to spend a fair amount of time with her, although we didn't live in Naperville most of my life, but we used to come back every summer because my father was a school teacher. And I have also been her publisher.
That's great. And we look forward to hearing a lot more about what that relationship was like and what May Watts was like on that personal side. We also have Dr. William Barnett. Will is joining us today. And Will, would you mind sharing with the audience a little bit about your work and the work that you've done that centers around May Watts?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Will Barnett. I teach history at North Central College in Naperville. I'm a professor of history and also of environmental studies. And I learned about May Watts in grad school. And then when I moved to Naperville, realized that there were papers to research her in two different archives here. And so I wrote a book chapter about her for a recent collection of essays about Chicago's environmental history.
Yeah, thank you, Will. We also have Mary Lou Wehrli. Mary Lou is probably well known to our community and has a really great connection also to May Watts. Mary Lou, would you mind giving us a little peek into your relationship with her?
Sure. May Watts lived in the neighborhood a few blocks away from me. And when I was in high school, I was interested in the newly formed Naperville Park District. And one of their first acquisitions was Springbrook Golf Course. They bought a farm. And I worked at a stable right across the way. And I thought it would be great if it had a trail for horseback riding around it. And her name popped up and I walked. Well, I'll tell you the story when it's time. Anyway, I've served on the Naperville Park District Board of Commissioners for 6 years and the DuPage County Forest Preserve Board of Commissioners for 8 years, and I've been a longtime trail user and advocate.
Thank you, Mary Lou. And finally, we have Ann Covert. Ann, would you please share with us a little bit about your work and the work that you've done to keep the legacy of May Watts alive? Oh, sorry, Ann, you're on mute.
There we go. I apologize. Thank you. I am a teacher at May Watts Elementary School. I've been teaching here for 23 years, and I am presently teaching 5th grade, and I also teach the environmental club here and have just been able to really continue to bring who May Watts was and what she did for the environment and for our area to all of these young people learning here in this school. It's my delight to follow her ways and to do what she did to educate children, and I work to do that myself as well.
That's great. And May Watts Elementary is just one of the many living legacies that she's left for us today. And thank you all again for joining us. I am going to hand the program over to Dr. Barnett, who will share with you an overview of some of the accomplishments of May Watts. And I believe we have a few slides to share too with the audience. And Will, if you want to get started, I believe you're on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Hello, folks. I want to talk a little bit about May Watts, linking her to Morton Arboretum, which is a really important institution in this region, where she worked for over 20 years, and also linking her to the Illinois Prairie Path, which stretches across all of DuPage County. And the Prairie Path was the brainchild of May Watts, although it was a group of grassroots activists, mainly women in DuPage County, who brought that idea to fruition with her. So I'll be doing sort of a chronological overview of her story. May Watts was born in 1893 in Chicago, and she died in Naperville in the house that I'll show a picture of in a minute in 1975. So her life really spans from the time of Teddy Roosevelt and the conservation movement to the era of Earth Day and modern environmentalism in the 1970s. And she was part of that bridge of connecting those different periods of time. I first came across May Watts when I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in a class on environmental history and environmental studies, and we read her book, Reading the Landscape, which was published in 1957. It's a minor classic that many people who are interested in ecology and environmental studies treasure. If you want to buy a copy of Reading the Landscape, it's on sale at Morton Arboretum, where she spent the longest period of her career. I would compare it to Alda Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, which is a more famous book that's really nationally known. But both May Watts and Alda Leopold are introducing readers to the Midwestern landscape and to the idea of ecology, to the idea that all things are connected, and that there has been a lot of pressure in the mid-20th century with building of roads and highways and airports on the natural world, and that we need to be more careful about preserving things, and for Alda Leopold, about trying to restore damaged areas. I'd also link her to Rachel Carson, whose book is often credited with being the start of the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s. All three of these authors were trained scientists who were also beautiful writers who wrote for a regular audience rather than a scientific audience. Rachel Carson really was ringing an alarm bell that the U.S. the U.S. environment's in danger, that if we don't stop spreading pesticides everywhere, we're going to kill all the birds, and there will be a spring with silence, with no bird song. But I think all three of these authors and a number of others are crucial to educating the American public about the idea of ecology, and about the threats that are facing mid-20th century nature and ecology and environments. This is the house that May Watts lived in as a married woman in Naperville, and it's directly across the street from North Central's campus. I didn't put that together until I'd been on campus for a year or two, but it's across the street from the new Science Center at North Central College. I thought it would be good to name the Science Center after May Watts, but they named it after the person who wrote the biggest check to help build the building instead. So as a new professor at North Central, I learned that Sterling Morton Library at Morton Arboretum had an extensive collection of May Watts papers, and that the Osterly Library on our campus was holding the Illinois Prairie Paths papers. So I realized that I could do a local history research project without driving more than 15 or 20 minutes from home, and explore the career of a grassroots activist. And I think one important thing to realize is that the environmental movement is not just top down with famous people who are presidents, but much more of a grassroots bottom-up movement of everyday people trying to improve their local community. And May Watts is a great example of that activism, in her case, of women in the suburbs trying to preserve green space. And they did it with great success. When you go into the archives, especially at Morton Arboretum, it's filled with original artwork by May Watts. She was, in addition to being a beautiful writer, she was a talented artist. And these are all teaching tools because she was a teacher when she, even while she was an undergrad, she was a school teacher. And then at Morton Arboretum, she ran their education program. So there's lots of artwork that displays her effort to show people how ecology is connected. And this is an example of a detailed study she did of prairie grasses and moving to this region. You get acquainted with prairie. I grew up in New York, and it's not a landscape that I'm familiar with. And May Watts actually wrote that she had to get acquainted with prairie. At first, it seemed rather cold and unwelcoming, but she grew to love the prairie ecosystems and was calling the alarm that these prairie ecosystems were disappearing incredibly quickly. So I'm going to start with a little bit about her education, both from her family and her college education. She graduated from the University of Chicago in 1918. She was actually in her mid-20s at that point. Next slide, please. Thanks. But really, the first mentor in her life on all things about nature and nature study and plants were her parents, and especially her father, David. The Theilgaards both were born in Denmark, and they came to the US. They raised 4 daughters in Chicago, and all 4 of those daughters went on to achieve a great deal, especially given that they were born in the 1890s, becoming a high school principal, a lifelong Chicago teacher. And so these daughters learned to garden because their father was a professional gardener trained in Denmark. Each girl had a 3-foot by 6-foot garden plot that was their own. So the 4 sisters were gardeners, and they also, every weekend, they had a time where they would do artwork. And so this love of nature, including learning the Latin names of plants, comes from her father, David, and his training. And the love of artwork is something that she grew up with from being a girl with her 3 sisters. This is just an example of May Watts as an older woman. I think most of us have seen photographs of her as an older woman, if any. And this is a typical view of her outdoors, sketching and drawing a canoe. And there are hundreds of other pieces of artwork that I could show. I'm just dropping a few into this rapid slideshow. When she went to college at the University of Chicago, she took summer classes for most of her degree. She was working from the age of 18 as a high school teacher. These are some photos of her with her second great mentor after her father, with Professor Henry Chandler Cowles on the right. And these are photographs from, she got a degree in botany and she graduated Phi Beta Kappa. These are photographs from field trips, and especially during the summer, Dr. Cowles took his students on field trips to places like the Indiana Dunes, to places like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I put this slide up in an environmental studies class, and one of the students gasped and said, "How tall was she?" She's the tall woman on the left. Her driver's license in the archive says she was 5'11", so a very tall woman, especially for her time period. Henry Chandler Cowles is a really important scholar and is seen as one of the founders of the scientific field of ecology. He taught in the botany department. He's credited with being one of the people who innovated the ideas of ecological succession and dynamic ecology. And he wrote his most famous book about the Indiana Dunes, which is a place that May Watts visited with him as a student on field trips, and then would bring other people when she was leading the field trips later. And this is another photo of Dr. Cowles on the far right with May Watts immediately next to him. And these field trips could go for weeks. And it's interesting to me that I think that about 3/4 of the students are women in this picture. And he was an incredibly influential teacher, and many of his students became very important scientists and spread the idea of ecology to high schools and colleges all across the nation. She dedicated her book, Reading the Landscape, to him, writing Dr. Henry C. Cowles, inspired teacher at the University of Chicago, great and first American ecologist. He taught me how to read. And of course, she means that he taught her how to read the landscape, to go outside and study nature like you could study a book and understand that this used to be a wetland, and then these trees moved in, and now it's moving towards a forest. So this is the whole idea of ecological succession that she learned. She stopped teaching in 1924 when she married Raymond Watts, and they had a family of 4. They moved to Ravinia in Highland Park, where the music festivals are, and lived there from 1927 to 1941. She was mainly raising her children at that point, but she was also involved in nature study, in publishing poetry, in artwork, and working with garden clubs. This is a picture of May Watts as a young woman that you don't see as many of, with her first child in 1926. And this is a picture of a third important mentor for her, Jens Jensen, who's a world-famous landscape architect. Like her father, he's from Denmark. I think the two men had a lot in common. Her father was a trained gardener, and so was Jens Jensen. He believed very much in using native plants to the region, using Midwest plants and Midwest gardens, and he was a key figure in building the parks of Chicago. And they were neighbors in Ravinia. And she became very involved in his group, Friends of the Native Landscape, that she would lead trips to places like Starved Rock State Park, to places like the Indiana Dunes, and people would go to learn from her and Jens Jensen about the ecosystems of the Midwest. This is just a couple drawings that she did when she was in Ravinia. She published a pamphlet for her neighbors to learn what were important rare plants that they shouldn't dig up and replace with lawns. And she was bothered that everybody would plant, sterile green lawns instead of the wildflowers of this area, Ravinia. While she was in Ravinia, she took a job at Morton Arboretum. The Arboretum, the daughter of the founder of the Arboretum, Jean Morton Cudahy, had met May Watts through all her speeches at garden clubs and through Jens Jensen Organization to Save the Native Landscape, and brought her on to be the head of the education program and to create the education program at Morton Arboretum. And so she was a naturalist and an educator there, and trained many other naturalists and educators there from 1939 to 1961. This is one of my favorite pictures. It gives you a sense of the fun in their time. Her neighbor and friend Helen Turner is laughing, and May Watts is standing, and they are showing a classroom of students at the Arboretum, different leaves and plants. All kinds of people came together around her classes. So there were hundreds of people who would go on field trips with her around the Arboretum, who would take classes. Some of them were Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts. Teachers would bring their students, bird watchers, hikers, all kinds of people would go to Morton Arboretum to learn about ecology from May Watts. A couple black and white photos of these groups. Many adults were there as well as students. And in reading about it, it seems to me overwhelmingly that this was women teaching other women, that she would find, younger housewives who were living in the area who would become volunteers at Morton Arboretum, and then they would start leading their own programs. And a number of them were really inspired by her as a role model, and talked about how troubling times were during the Cold War, the 1950s, but she gave them hope, and she encouraged them to feel that they could make the world better. So, and just a few more pieces of artwork. She drew a map of several different maps of the Arboretum. She was really bothered that they cut the major road through the Arboretum, splitting it in half. That was something that she wrote letters to the editor about, and beautiful line drawings of trees in different seasons. The Arboretum bookstore still sells a number of her tree finders that you could use leaves to identify trees. One of them published with her son, Tom, in the lower left, Winter Tree Finder, also a desert tree finder. So these small pocket-sized books are still in print and are still sold at Morton Arboretum. She moved to Naperville in 1941, I think partly to be closer to the Arboretum because she was working there full time, but partly to get away from the sort of suburban sprawl of Ravinia and Highland Park. Of course, that suburban sprawl would follow her to Naperville. But it seems like, and this is she lived, the next 34 years of her life in Naperville, but the community changed dramatically during those years from the World War I through the 1970s. This is the house she lived in, and her friend Helen Turner lived in the house immediately to the north of it. It's now sort of a dark blue, and the house next door is yellow. The elm trees that are in this picture from when May Watts lived there are gone. One of the problems of the environment, of the changes that are happening with ecology. So back to reading the landscape, she was living in this house in 1957 when she published the book, and still an important figure in the education department at Morton Arboretum. She continued working there until she had a stroke. But this is a book that's still in print, that is still read by people to learn about ecology. So this was, one of her major contributions was this book. Another one was shaping the Morton Arboretum to be such an educational center for nature study. And then, she was in her mid-60s when she published this book, and was 70 when she spearheaded the Illinois Prairie Path. A quote from Reading the Landscape describes the idea in the title. There is good reading on the land. The records are written in forests, in fence rows, in bogs, and tree rings. Interpreting this reading matter in place on the land, seeing living things in their total environment, is an adventure into the field that is called ecology. And every chapter of this book is really a field trip, and includes chapters of going to the Indiana Dunes. But that time period while she was living in DuPage County, the county grew hugely. The O'Hare Airport opened in the mid-50s, and then Harold Mosher's large suburban developments started spreading across Naperville in the mid-50s and early 60s. Interstate 88 was finished in 58. The two big labs that are so important for DuPage County, Argonne and Fermi, were growing in the 60s in the Cold War, and the enormous mall at Oak Brook developed. So in about a dozen years, this community in Naperville that she'd moved to, that was really sort of on the edge of farm country, became central to this new sort of high-tech corridor of suburbia. And she was bothered by it. She wrote letters to the editor complaining that Naperville had shrunk the park in the center of town. And obviously, I said she didn't like the road splitting through Morton Arboretum. And so the final story I want to tell is about her organizing the Illinois Prairie Path. She was seeing a dramatic loss of green space, and the Prairie Path links together green space. She was seeing a huge decline in farmland, and there wasn't much prairie left in DuPage County when she moved there, and prairie was disappearing at an incredibly rapid rate during this time. So she was looking to hold on to sort of remnant relics of prairie that still existed. So the chapter of her life when starting when she was 70 was really, not working as a teacher, which she'd done for much of her life, but becoming an activist and organizing the Illinois Prairie Path. The logo shows that it's a multi-use path for foot travel, for horseback riding, and for bicycles, and that they're pulling out the railroad ties and the stakes and turning this into a nature path. The land that the path was on was originally an electric interurban railway. And this is the path of that. But because of the growth of the interstate highways, this electric interurban railway went out of business. And she was worried that the abandoned railroad track would become yet another road through the region. And she thought this was a great opportunity for rails to trail. So that wasn't an idea at the time. Either this path or another one in Wisconsin are the first rails to trails projects in the nation. The two groups argue a bit about who was first. But she thought this abandoned railway was a place that you could walk along and see prairie grasses because they were sort of undeveloped, unplowed, and unbuilt areas, and that it was a wonderful place to go for nature study, and she wanted to preserve it. This is the photograph of the interurban railway when it's still running. It ran from 1899 to 1957, but the interstate highways killed it. And this is the Ovaltine factory in Villa Park. A quote from the start of the Prairie Path. She wrote a letter to the editor just as a private citizen at age 70 in 1963 to the Chicago Tribune. And she said, "We need a footpath. Right now, there's a chance for Chicago and its suburbs to have a footpath, a long one. The right-of-way of the Aurora Electric Railroad lies waiting. If we have the courage and the foresight, such as made possible the Long Trail in Vermont and the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia, then we can create from this strip a proud resource." She continued, "That is all in the future, the possible future. Right now, the right-of-way lies waiting, and many hands are itching for it. Many bulldozers are drooling. That might sound over dramatic, but to think about the bulldozers that plowed through the interstate highway, all the suburban developments, Fermi Lab and Argonne Lab, she'd seen many bulldozers come across this place, and she wanted it not to happen here. And you wouldn't think a 70-year-old woman writing a letter to the editor in the Chicago Tribune would start this movement, but she was an incredibly well-connected woman. She had a Rolodex full of teachers and artists and scout leaders and bird watching groups, garden groups, and some very well-connected, well-educated women. And they put this plan into action, just like they put into action all the education programs at Morton Arboretum. So this is what the path looks like now. The railroad's obviously gone. The power lines are still there because they had to negotiate with the electric utility companies, the county governments, the city governments, all of these complicated negotiations. And it took about a decade, starting in 1963, to make this fully operational. But by 1966, they were having dramatic success. So this was clearly already happening. So their very first field trip was, so much of her story is field trips with Dr. Cowles as a student at University of Chicago, field trips across Morton Arboretum to take people outside to learn in the open air, and then taking those same kind of people to walk the railroad track that had been abandoned. Helen Turner's on the right, a number of different people on the left listening to May Watts talk about this vision she has for this path. So it all starts in 1963. And it is still a treasured part of our county, and stretching into 2 neighboring counties to this day. A team of women put out a regular newsletter, hand-done artwork. They spoke at libraries and at different public schools all around the region, building support for this. And they were able to negotiate with all the needed government and corporate agencies, and achieve this remarkable outcome. This is before Earth Day, which is 1970. We all think of Earth Day as when people start cleaning up the local environment, but these people are hauling railroad ties, a huge volunteer force. And many of these people, whether they were retired or they were, young parents, dedicated countless hours to creating the Illinois Prairie Path. First just removing the railroad ties, removing invasive species, and it was really run by the path for several decades before insurance purposes made them turn it over to the county government. So I think many people in the region know it, might just know small parts of it, but people from all over this region worked together. Wayne, in the northwest corner of DuPage County, was one of the centers of activism. A lot of the people rode horses in that part of the county. There are also important people in Naperville, but she really was an expert at bringing people together and networking and motivating them. And it's as the upper right-hand corner of this map shows, that they're claiming that it's North America's first successful rails to trails conversion. And this is now being done all across the country and across the world. So I just want to leave off with this photo of May Watts, and then people enjoying the trail. And if the next slide shows the book that if you want to read more about this talk, I published with a colleague, Ann Durkin-Keating at North Central College, and another colleague from the University of Oklahoma, a book in 2020 called City of Lake and Prairie, Chicago's Environmental History. And one of the last chapters in the book is about May Watts and the Illinois Prairie Path. So thanks for going back to school with me for 15 or 20 minutes. And now we can move on to the people who knew May Watts personally rather than having studied her in the archives.
And Will, thank you so much for sharing your scholarship with us. I know that presentation is the shortened version of so much of the work that you've done and that you regularly share with people. And so I know with your work, May Watts certainly will not be forgotten. And I think so many of us, we see the school, we see the parks that are named after her, but for you to give us this view of her as educator, naturalist, environmentalist, and artist was really, really great. So thank you for doing that for us.
Oh, it's nice to share it with interested people. Thank you for inviting me.
And for our audience, we want to make sure to let you all know that we are going to put on Facebook and in various places resources to Dr. Barnett's work. We'll make sure that you can see some of the digital archives that are available at Morton Arboretum, and we'll also put some links to the Illinois Prairie Path, so that you'll know how to get there. And speaking of the Prairie Path, I want to turn this over to Mary Lou. Mary Lou Wehrli, you are very, I think, familiar with some of the amazing accomplishments of May Watts and her advocacy for the Prairie Path. But could you share with us kind of your personal interactions with May Watts and how that affected you?
Yes, thank you very much, Janet. It was very exciting. As a young high school student, the Naperville Park District had been formed in 1966, and by the time I was in junior or sophomore in high school, they had purchased their first farm, which became Springbrook Golf Course. I happened to work in the summers at the stable across the way and was into horses all around the neighborhood, as many people were. And I thought, well, they bought all this farmland and it'd be great if we could ride our horses, around it, and it wouldn't just be for golfers. So somehow her name came up, and she only lived a few blocks away from me. And I walked over there one early evening and knocked on the door, and she came out on the front porch. And she was very tall and imposing, and there was just some presence about her. She was just so strong and just radiated knowledge and listening. She was a good listener. And so I had talked to her about this, and you're working on trails, and what do you do about getting a horse trail? And she suggested that I write a letter to the editor, which I did, and I actually found it. It was not as well written as once you're educated and experienced, but it was a way of showing a high school kid. In hindsight, I can see how she was encouraging, not to go to some grown up and tell help, see if they can help you. She was telling me what the tools were that were out there to bring an opinion like the Prairie Path and here a horse path to the public. So that was an early introduction to my public involvement in trails. The horse trail never got made, which was kind of good because the horses kind of all went away from Naperville. But it did fire my interest in running for park board and serving in Naperville, and then the Forest Preserve Commission, where trails, every public survey we've ever done have always the public puts trails number one and connectivity as number one. And now DuPage County has 26,012 acres, which is 12% of the county is in forest preserve. Naperville Park District has 2,600 acres that are many dedicated to trails. There are intergovernmental partnerships between the parks and the county and the forest preserve and the cities that work together through those complicated details that Will brought up regarding making the Prairie Path. There are many complexities to do that, but it still comes down for what people really want to see contribute to their quality of life. And I'm very pleased to see in the more recent years, people are recognizing it's just not a trail for us humans. It's a trail that saves open space, that glorifies and presents native plants in their context, that bring us the pollinators. And all of these things are giving us the quality of life we want, give us an opportunity to continue to volunteer in our communities at whatever level. If you want to collect seeds at Fermilab or our forest preserves, if you want to help plant trees or learn about acorns. The Hobson Oak Project was one I was involved in a few years back in Naperville to take a very sacred and honored 250-year-old oak tree whose time had come to an end. And in partnership with the county and the Naperville Park District and the Morton Arboretum, we were able to germinate over 300 acorns from that last batch of her acorns. And so that perpetuates not only oaks in your backyard, but also along the trails. And in our schools, we had Girl Scouts buy a couple of trees for, Prairie School has some. So as we all get involved, I'd like to give 2 shout outs to the DuPage County Forest Preserve for their trail linkages and for the public studies that they've done on Green Valley and Blackwell and Waterfall Glen. Blackwell in particular, because what came out in that study was number one, let's have trails, let's get ourselves safely from Winfield Road to Route 59. And they would like Blackwell Forest Preserve to be the conduit for that, which is contiguous to those 2 destinations. I hope Warrenville will change its mind about trying to put the trail across private property on the other side of the street. So these little tweaks to our government, where we're all little tugboats bumping our ship of state, are still opportunities for us to make our world a better place. And I thank you for the opportunity to share some of my passion with trails and my total admiration and stunning awe of Theilgaard Watts.
Yeah, that is amazing. Just kind of listening to that story and how the different ways that May Watts impacted the community in big and small ways, and it really, I think, shows. It illustrates through her work, through your work, and the work that has spread through there, like how much of a difference an individual can make.
Oh, yes.
And I'm thinking, the Hobson oak that you just mentioned. My parents have one in their backyard from that project, and I have a baby one now from their oak, and it has just spread far and wide, right?
It has, and they're reproducing. Mine had its first acorns last year, and I'll tell you, this next week, the Noon Whistle Brewery is coming out with this next batch of Hobson Oak beer. So keep your eyes peeled for that. There's a lot of resources that have been coming from this oak tree.
Yeah, that is amazing. I am going to turn it over to Anne now. One of the things that led us to focus on May Watts and to kind of think about this panel was the fact that May Watts has an elementary school in our district, in the 41st district, named after her. Anne, would you mind sharing your efforts on what you're doing to keep her legacy alive for the students in our community?
Sure. Yeah. And it's an honor to even just talk about her. I do consider her a hero of mine. And so my role here at this school, and what a wonderful school it is. And if people have never even known what the school grounds look like, that too is it's just a wonderful message for it to be called May Watts School because of all of the natural area we have behind where children go and play like she would want us to do. What we have been doing at May Watts Elementary School, we've had an ecology club here for over 20 years. So it is going to be something that any student is going to be able to know that we focus on the things that she wanted everybody to know, their awareness of plants and their understanding of trees and the importance of wide open spaces. So I have had the honor then too, again, to teach this club for over 20 years. It is provided for 4th and 5th graders, so they are the upper elementary students, and it's just kind of fun sometimes to see little ones get excited about wanting to be in the club, and then they can. It has sure been true that this school continues to partner with Morton in some ways. We go on field trips to Morton Arboretum. The school does a very large thing to celebrate Earth Week and Earth Day. And we have a play about May Watts, and we put it on in our stage. In fact, those dramatic bulldozers you were talking about, you might enjoy seeing our cardboard bulldozers that we push across the stage just to kind of give the message that May Watts had about the effect those bulldozers had on her in Ravinia. And we use her tree finders. When I came to this school, that box of tree finder books was available on the library shelf, and I scooped them up and help little ones understand how to use the books. She wrote songs, she had finger plays, she had little words of wisdom to try to teach children how to understand what she was seeing in nature. And kindergarten teachers and 1st grade teachers will use them, and we try to help keep that alive when new teachers come along, and we have to kind of educate them on that this stuff is available. There have been vegetable gardens in the past. We have a flower garden out front of the school, which is called the May Watts Flower Garden. It's very special that we have this body of water, this pond, and students are able to go out there and just have some very hands-on learning, scooping up water, looking at it under a microscope. And all of these things in my mind, and I hope that I'm doing service in a way that does reflect on her, that she would want us to do these things and to engage and to continue to just celebrate and learn how to read the landscape like she did. And it hasn't been an effort. It's been easy. The area we have around us too just even provides for teachers to take kids outside and to spend time outside. It is also true that we just try to help them mimic some of her ways of sketching and painting, and those parts of just being an elementary student would be easy to do. But it in my heart and in my mind, I do just always try to think about what would May Watts do, or what would she say, and how would she think, or what would she feel about what we are trying to do to live up to who she was as an educator. It seems to be that it's still strong, and we are planning our Earth Week, getting ready to give our message out to the school like we let all of the kids do for each other. And it has really honestly been an absolute joy of mine, being an environmental education major myself. This has been a perfect fit for me, and I have her to thank for all of it. I really do.
I think that's really wonderful that you're keeping her story alive for your students. Because I think about a lot of the schools that, you know, and how they're named, and I don't know that you know, the students necessarily know the background and the histories that are behind these namesakes. So thank you for that work, for doing that.
Yes,
Um,
you're welcome.
Bridget, can I turn it to you? I mean, we have heard all these wonderful stories of your grandmother, and I could just can't imagine the pride that you must feel in hearing about her work. Could you tell us a little bit about, you know, what, you know, her as a grandmother, as a mother, as a family matriarch, and would love to hear your story.
Well, my perspective on her is partly shaped by my direct experience, but also by what I know about her earlier life. And Dr. Barnett gave us a lot of that. She was born on May 1st, 1893, the opening day of the World's Fair in Chicago. And she was one of 4 girls, and those oldest 3 girls, after graduating from high school in Chicago, this is how she ended up studying in the summers at the University of Chicago. After they graduated from high school, they went to work as school teachers. They were very smart and ambitious, but they also needed to support themselves. They were working class. And in the fall, they would each take a train out to a different farming community west of Chicago to live with a farmer's family and teach in a 1-room schoolhouse until the spring. But in the summer, they could come back, live at home, and they attended the University of Chicago, which had a summer institute for teachers. And Dr. Barnett, you mentioned that the people on the field trips tended to be women, and I think that's because this was the summer institute for teachers who were mostly women. The students who attended who could afford to attend full-time during the winter might have gone on longer field trips to the Rockies or something, but the school teachers went with Dr. Cowles to the Indiana Dunes and places around Chicago. Donna, if you'd like to show the slide of the field trip again, my first photo. This is the picture that we saw earlier with May on the field trip with Dr. Cowles. And yeah, there they are. And she's the one in the tie. I didn't know she was 5'11". I'm 5'11". I thought she was maybe a little shorter than me, but of course she was old by the time I knew her. But one thing I'll point out about this picture is that the woman had to wear their skirts when they were on the train to the dunes. But when they got there, they would change into these pants, or maybe they just ripped the skirts off that they had on over the pants. So in 1918, she did graduate from the University of Chicago, and now she had a college degree, and she could get a teaching job in the Chicago Public Schools, which she did. And she also wrote. She wanted to be a writer. She wrote poetry and short stories. And then on a walk with the aforementioned Friends of Our Native Plants, she met a handsome former pilot. There he is, my grandfather, Lieutenant Raymond Watts, who worked in an ad agency in the Chicago Loop. And this photo is him as he was circa 1917 or 18 when he was fighting in France and England. So on this walk, Ray Watts got a terrible case of poison ivy, but evidently he enjoyed himself anyway because he and May were married in 1924. Her poem Vision, a love poem appropriately, was included in the best poems of 1925. Their daughter Erica was born in 1926, Nancy in 27. You could show the next photo. This is May with her daughters. She's dressed up to visit the in-laws in Southern Illinois. In 1928, they had the house built for them in Ravinia, north of Chicago, which was kind of an artist colony at that point. My father, Tom, was born in 1929. So these were pretty good and prosperous years for them. But then the Great Depression hit. Raymond's ad agency failed, and he was out of work for a very long time, taking the train to Chicago to look for work until he ran out of fare for the train. And so May started lecturing and giving classes to earn money. And then came more challenges. In 1937, their son Peter was born with Down syndrome. In 1939, Erica had peritonitis and nearly died and had to be nursed at home for a year. And in 40 or 41, they lost the house in Ravinia that had been designed for them by an architect, presumably because they weren't able to pay the mortgage, and moved to Naperville. But by which time May had started working at the Morton Arboretum, where she was, as has been said, a charismatic and beloved teacher. And she and Raymond also started their publishing company, Nature Study Guild, that published The Tree Finder and other field guides, and later other books, and I ran that company for a while. What's impressive to me, thinking about my grandmother in the years before I was born, is how much she accomplished while facing so many challenges as a parent. Having a child with developmental disabilities in those days was really hard. There weren't any services, there was no inclusion. They couldn't send Peter to school. The normal thing was to put a child like that in an institution, but they didn't want to do that. And while she worked at the Arboretum, May left Peter with a farm woman who cared for him during the week. And she would bicycle out to the farm on the weekends to bring him home. And she cared for him at home when his health failed. And he died in 1947 at age 10. Also during the 40s, my Aunt Nancy told me May would come home from work and make dinner, and then she would go out again in the evening to speak to garden clubs to earn money to pay for Erica and Nancy's college tuition. So you can see by the time she got to advocating for the Illinois Prairie Path, she'd been doing a lot of talking, lecturing, and so on. So show the next photo. This is fast forward to the 1950s. That's me in the place of honor, the little girl next to May at the end of the table wearing a tinfoil crown that I'm sure that she made for me. I remember getting lots of attention and time with my grandmother, although she was still working full time until I was 11 and doing a lot of other things. But to me, she was a fabulous, fun grandmother. She was always finding ways to encourage my imagination. We made up stories and acted them out. We made little fairies from flowers in her garden and floated them on the pond. We sketched, we gardened. I hung out in the kitchen while she and my mother canned fruit. Then the next photo is me and her in her garden. You notice we each have our own book that we're reading. I love this photo. And other things were happening at this time was Reading the Landscape was published, as Dr. Barnett mentioned, and very well received. But in 1961, she had a stroke and retired from the Arboretum, but worked very hard to recover. And my Aunt Nancy, who was a physical therapist, was very impressed by how hard May worked to recover and how well she did. And by 2 years later, had discovered the abandoned railroad right-of-way that became the IPP and was leading walks to build support for a public path. She really believed in the right to wander, to move across the landscape, which was very difficult in the Midwest, where everything was, split up into squares by the Homestead Act, and private property went from edge to edge with roads in between. Unlike England, where she had fallen in love with public paths that had pre-existed before the idea of land as private property that you could have complete control over and keep people off really became firmly established. It's kind of ironic to me that these railroad rights of way became available only because of suburbanization, which killed off the railroads. And indeed, my memory of Naperville in my childhood was a small town surrounded by cornfields, which is certainly not what it is like today. Mary Lou's remarks reminds me of the impressions that my grandmother made on people. She was so charismatic and imposing and opinionated and funny and able to make people see things in new ways that they couldn't see before. Qualities that were very useful in advocating for the prairie path. The next photo is a lovely photo of her in her garden in 1963. My family wasn't very good at taking photos. I don't have many family photos, and many of them are out of focus. I think this was taken by a professional photographer. And it was lovely to see Helen Turner in some of these photos. Helen Turner lived right next door to May for many, many years. Was her very good friend. They made music together. They played recorders. They went on trips together. Helen helped her with her books, and especially as my grandfather's health was failing, Helen was kind of the Robin to my grandmother's Batman, and a lovely woman. So in 1966, my grandfather died. In 1971, Reading the Landscape of Europe, in which she wrote about the public paths in England, was published. In 1975, an expanded version of Reading the Landscape of America, where she went back and wrote some new chapters and some new essays about the places that she visited in the first book. And that is still in print. That I keep that in print. And in 1975, she died in her sleep in her own bed with an unfinished piece of writing in her typewriter, which, if you ask me, is a pretty good way to go. The next photo is from the Naperville Cemetery. It's the grave marker for Raymond, May, and Peter, affixed to a limestone boulder that used to be in front of the Watts house on Jefferson, which I've been told was sometimes graffitied by North Central students when it was there. So I'll leave it there.
Bridget, thank you so much for sharing that extra facet of May Watts and her life. We have made sure to include a link to the Facebook page and the site that you maintain, to make sure that her in memory of your grandmother, and the link to the website that you have for her books, just to make sure that people watching know how to get to that. And it's so special to be able to see that very personal side of her and her work, and it's I think a good reminder of all the work that women do, advocating for the prairie path, being an educator, going to the Morton Arboretum, but at the same time, like thinking about how she balanced that with her family life, and taking care of those domestic responsibilities. So many things always going on, I think, in all our lives, right? I would love to ask, maybe put Will and Anne on the spot, to allow you to actually to put Bridget and Mary Lou on the spot, given all your work, your scholarship around May Watts, and the how you're talking with your students about May Watts. We have two people here who knew her personally, worked with her closely. What are some of the things that you would want to know from people who knew her, as an individual?
Sure. I have a question, if I can ask. Maybe one thing I would like to know is, did she go to Europe, or did she go to England to get that fascination and that desire to write her book about the footpaths in England? So I kind of have I'm curious just about an answer for that one, if I can ask. Bridget?
Yeah, she and my grandfather made a trip in 1958. He wanted to revisit some of the sites of his experience there. And then I think in 1967, she went with at least one of her daughters. So probably, the book was based on those things. She did go back one more time. Her daughter Nancy took her for her 80th birthday. We went to England and Denmark, I believe.
Thank you. I like thinking about that. I do. Thank you.
I mean, since we're organizing this around Women's History celebration, I had a question reading her writings about whether you would think of her as a feminist in any kind of modern sense. I mean, she's writing a book that really is important in ideas of ecology and environment in the 1960s, around the same time that Betty Friedan is writing The Feminine Mystique. She's obviously an older woman than Betty Friedan, but she's I think it seemed like she really created a sisterhood of women teaching women and sort of empowering women to have a life outside of their suburban caring for children, that sort of expanded that circle to care for nature and to care for children. And it was always both. It was always sort of nature study for children, bringing scouts and classroom students into nature. Do you have any sense about whether you would think of her as a feminist and what she thought about this role that it seems like she became the breadwinner in the family for a while, and how you think about her in not only this 1960s environmental generation, but with the explosion of feminism?
Well, and actually, she did help with the breadwinning. My grandfather did get work before they moved to Naperville. I think he already had an engineering job, but that's a really interesting question, because part of the problem is, in the 60s, I was a teenager and not sufficiently interested in what my elders thought, which is, it just kills me that I didn't ask more questions about these things. But I don't remember any explicit discussion of feminism, but I would say that she was a feminist. I mean, in that family, it was very clear that women were believed to be equal and wanted opportunities beyond the traditional role, and very much encouraged her daughters. And there was family stories about some of the discrimination that the Theilgaard sisters had encountered. Like her sister Sophie actually rose to be assistant superintendent of the Chicago School District and did not get the final job, which would have been the next step. And the family story, and I'm sure it's true, was that this was the period when they were going to improve education by getting more men involved. And a man was promoted over her. There's a funny photo of them at some event, maybe when he's being installed, where she's, of course, taller than him, looking down at him like, you got the job I should have had. But that was talked about explicitly in my family. So I would say, yes, she was a feminist, but whether she identified explicitly with, the new wave feminism, I don't know. By the time it really broke, I mean, that was kind of late 60s when I really became aware of it, and by which time she was kind of towards the end of her life.
Thank you.
So maybe along those what Will's question about being an environmentalist or a naturalist, I'd love to know, and this kind of also goes into a question that we got from a member of the audience, Marilyn. So in about the 50 years that have passed since May Watts has passed, do you think that we have lost or gained ground when you think about preserving our natural areas?
we have totally gained ground. People are better educated, they're better voters, they're better taking care of their own things that they can control in the environment. They celebrate the environment, even businesses and the contributions that are made towards benefiting the earth and the trails and our coexistence have substantially improved. It's very exciting to see that business especially is recognizing the importance of nature and the quality of life, and people want to live in Naperville. I know in the early days when Argonne was built, they liked to be able to have a quick commute through the farmland to get to Argonne, but they brought to Naperville the wonderful valuing of education and got involved locally. And there's just so many threads that hold us together and keep us improving. And that speaks, as I mentioned before, with the amount of open space we have, the miles of trails that we have now. DuPage County itself is working now to improve its trail connectivity in the Southern Regional Trail. So we have, in my opinion, we're going strong and getting better.
I'd say that she really had a major impact on people's ideas about Midwestern landscapes, especially. I think, you know, an earlier generation of, you know, back in the early 1900s with people like Teddy Roosevelt, there was a focus on the Rocky Mountains and dramatic landscapes like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone Yosemite. But I think her generation is valuing wetlands and prairies and things that are not quite so dramatic and more for local people, that it's part of your everyday life, that you might just go for a walk on the prairie path or ride your bike there. And I think ideas that prairie matters takes a little bit more convincing to people. It's not as beautiful as a snow-covered mountain maybe, but ideas of preserving prairie and restoring prairie are spreading dramatically in the late 1900s and the early 21st century. Morton Arboretum scientists, Schulenburg Prairie was an early effort to restore prairie painstakingly, and she was working at Morton when that prairie restoration effort was going. Aldo Leopold had done things like that several decades earlier at University of Wisconsin-Madison's Arboretum, but she was part of a group of people who really popularized prairie. I mean, she chose Prairie Path to be the name of this path she created. And now we see efforts to restore prairie going on all over the place. The Nature Conservancy is a huge non-government organization now, a nonprofit. One of their best efforts to restore prairie is Nechusa Grasslands out by Dixon, Illinois, so over an hour west of Naperville. But Nechusa Grasslands is a Nature Conservancy project. They have, you know, bought up prairie that had never really been plowed up by farmers and are restoring it to health, and have introduced bison back onto the land. An even bigger project is Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie outside of Joliet, a former bomb-making factory that built TNT and landmines and bombs for World War II and Vietnam and Korea, was shut down, and the federal government is embarked on a multi-decade project to restore that industrial landscape to prairie. And you can also see bison at Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie. I think those are huge changes. We're not talking about a little tiny square of prairie, which is what University of Wisconsin-Madison was doing at their Arboretum, and Schulenburg Prairie is at Morton Arboretum, but dozens of square miles of prairie that's being restored at Medewin National Tallgrass Prairie, you know, half an hour drive south of Naperville. So the ideas that she spread about preserving prairie, about the value of sort of everyday landscapes in the Midwest are really bearing fruit. So, you know, decades later, I think she's been really influential in a cohort of people she worked with, like Schulenburg at Morton Arboretum. They've really made a difference.
I think that that emphasis on the more domestic nearby landscapes also reflects her life history and her life as a woman, and as someone with had to work and had domestic responsibilities, that the model of someone who wrote about nature was a man going out into the wilderness a long time. And she was like, oh, look at what's growing in this parking strip over here, what's growing in this person's yard. This is interesting, and this tells a story too. I'm glad to hear there's a lot of prairie restoration. That's cool.
Bridget, can I ask, do you still have some of her art pieces or her poetry with you or in the family?
Well, I have some poetry she wrote that wasn't published. Some of it's not good. I mean, the that poem Vision has been anthologized widely. You can find it. It was in an anthology of love poems by a woman a few years ago. I don't have a little bit of her artwork. Some of it's at the Morton Arboretum, or Will seems to have found quite a bit of stuff.
A lot of it's at Morton Arboretum because they were really teaching tools for all the different classes they ran there.
I have a question for Bridget. Do you recall on the walls of your home, I know when it was flipped for the first time after the family, or maybe in between, there were paintings on the wall and staircase. Do you know the origin of those? Did May paint those?
She did. There was, I mean, I remember from my childhood was this big, it was a big, tall, it was sort of a big, tall stairway, and there were painting all along that she had made, this fanciful landscapes with fairies and elves and things. I have one almost faded Polaroid picture somebody took of part of that. When I think of how we photograph everything all the time now, and I have no photograph of that. And I guess it got painted over at some point. So there was that painting. And in my childhood, the upstairs bathroom, one of two, had sayings on the walls, like "He who lies down with dog arises with fleas." What else? I don't know. She was very fanciful, and the kitchen, the kitchen cabinet had paintings, like the red paintings of little villages and people riding on bicycles and stuff that she did. It was probably very Scandinavian style that she had, very playful.
Well, that is just really, really, again, so nice to hear that personal side of her story. Our hour has come and gone, and it has flown by. And I just want to thank all of you for gifting us with your time, letting us know just so much more about May Watts, about this wonderful woman and her incredible accomplishments with us and the viewers today. So just want to again thank you for sharing May Watts' story, for helping us to celebrate this Women's History Month. As we wrap up this conversation, I want to remind everyone that we're going to have this recording on our Facebook page, our YouTube page. We'll have a number of the resources that we've talked about throughout this talk. We will try to absolutely find that poem and link to that too. That's an additional facet of her that I had no idea about, and that was really, really neat to learn. And again, thank you again for taking the time to share these stories. They are truly a gift to our community, just as May Watts was a gift. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to remember and to be inspired again by her work.
Yes, this is very fun.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Good night.